So the first thing we wanted to talk about today is that the AI training controversy is heating up. What do we mean by that? Of course, all of these giant LLMs are trained on massive corpora of data. And this controversy isn't new. Think about when the ChatGPT 4 image generation update came out and suddenly everyone was doing Studio Ghibli. And there was a whole controversy about is this fair use or not? Just in the last couple of days, BBC in the UK have threatened legal action over AI content scraping against Perplexity, which is the AI-based question and answer search engine. Aardman Animation Studio, creators of the incredible stop-motion Wallace and Gromit, amongst many others, have also said, if this doesn't stop, if this training of AI tools on our copyrighted content doesn't stop, then that could jeopardize our entire future. So there's a lot of heat around that, and it's only going to grow. But at the same time, there was a very interesting lawsuit in the US that had a very interesting outcome. Anthropic, maker of Claude AI, was sued in the US over training on copyrighted books. And this was the first big trial that was really about the question of fair use, right? Because the defenders of AI say the AIs are doing exactly what you and I do. When we read a book, we remember that book. When we look at artworks, we remember that artworks. And if we have some talent, Chris, which I don't, you can produce works in a similar style, right? If I've read a bunch of Ghibli comic books, I practiced it, then I can draw some Studio Ghibli, right? And so the idea is, well, the AI are doing the same thing. That is fair use. Now, that's what this trial was about. And basically, this was a win for the fair use argument, although the actual judgment was mixed. What the judgment found was that Anthropic's use of all of this copyrighted material to train its AI was indeed fair use. In other words, it can read all these books and it can remember the books and it can form part of its large language model. However, it turns out that Anthropic was actually using a corpus of pirated books. So they'd never actually bought the books in the first place. They just pirated a bunch of copyrighted books and they trained on that. And that is not okay. You wouldn't download a car or something like that, right, Chris?
You wouldn't steal a car. You wouldn't steal a
I
house.
don't know, man.
So why would you steal a video?
You wouldn't download a car, man. So this is interesting. So actually, Anthropic are in a lot of trouble, but not for the reason that would make anybody else worried. They got in trouble because they didn't buy the material that they used to train on, but the actual training was okay. So this speaks to the fact that you need to make sure that you come across your training data via legitimate grounds. So if you are training on copyrighted material, Chris, you've got to buy that material. But once you've bought it, it is fair use for you to train an LLM on it, which is quite fascinating. And I think for the AI industry writ large, although this is bad for Anthropic, apparently the worst case damages could be up to $750 billion for Anthropic, although I'm sure it won't end up that high. For the industry more broadly, this is actually a very positive judgment.
To be more precise, if you're going to use copyright material that is being sold for a fee, you have to buy it. If you're using copyrighted material that is available in the public, you don't have to buy it, it sounds like, according to this judgment, right? So if it is on a website and you could access it without paying, even though it's copyright, it is free for you to use as part of your training set. But if you have to buy the material, it's behind some kind of wall, in this case, a physical book or a corpus of books in a digital store, you have to purchase that. I think this is the right answer, and it's related to the answer that James Cameron touched on that we talked about a few episodes ago, which is he said, I think this is all mixed up in the wrong way around. I can watch Star Wars. You can't stop me from watching Star Wars and adding the Star Wars motif, the Star Wars cinematography, the Star Wars visual language to my mental model, he said. But if I go and produce a movie called Avatar that looks exactly like Star Wars, then I'm violating copyright. And so I have to go imbue Avatar with my own creative influences, my own ideas, and sufficient differentiation so that I don't get dinged for copyright. And so, I thought that was a very interesting example because it's clear that Avatar borrows heavily from Star Wars and many other science fiction shows, and Fern Gully, by the way. And so, I thought he was the exact right person to say this. And I think he's thinking about it the exact right way. And it looks like the courts agree with him, basically. And so, yeah, I think this is the right place for it to land. And I think it unlocks AI companies to do what they've been doing, just they can't go and use pirated pirated corpuses of data. They're going to go pay for them.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's a lot of nuance here, and it kind of paints to the artificiality of copyright laws in the first place, because there are some weird things that happen, right? Which is that when an AI is trained on all of Star Wars, at least some models, some of the more sophisticated models, if you then say, please create a video clip of Star Wars Episode 4, it can pretty much do that. It's not quite all the way there, but it can reproduce the content with stunning accuracy, because in a sense, it can have what might have once been called a photographic memory. So the question is, if you've been trained on Star Wars and you then have the ability to reproduce what you've been trained on, that's when it becomes a bit problematic. And everything in copyright is a question of degree. It's not black or white. Everything is in the grays. And so I said it before when we discussed the James Cameron stuff. We really need to engineer copyright laws as a society to give us the results that we want. This is not like a natural property law. This is really about a type of social engineering to say we want to create an incentive structure in society that allows people to be incentivized, rewarded for creative work, but ultimately for that creative work to enter the public domain so that society as a whole can build on its own intellectual legacy, right? So that we can stand on the shoulders of giants. And this new technology has come in, and I do believe it is a threat and a challenge to copyright as it was conceived, say, for the 20th century. We need a 21st century version of copyright. Just bluntly applying the existing rules doesn't work very well. It didn't work very well when the internet came around, and this just makes it worse. So we've been limping along with a broken copyright system actually for a long time, Chris, and I'm not sure where this is all going to go, but there is a lot of money and a lot of public utility here. And so I imagine at some point a compromise, an equilibrium point will be reached where we can get the value out of all this material, but the creators are also compensated for it.
Yeah, actually, I don't know that the LLMs have perfect memory, right? I think they actually have they have a kind of memory like humans where the memory is imperfect, but that's neither here nor there. I think the example you gave is still one of output versus input. Right? So yes, if I ask it to create or to reproduce episode 7 and it does that, that's the copyright violation. And if I ask it to make another episode of Star Wars for me and I, distribute that for money, that's a copyright violation. But if I ask it to make something in the spirit of Star Wars, but change everything to blue aliens and, put on a planet called Pandora, now it's Avatar. And that's not a copyright violation. Well, at least not of George Lucas. So yeah, I think this is super interesting. I agree with you also that the law needs to evolve. Maybe we call it Copyright Plus. Let's get to work on that, guys. Let us know when you've cracked the code.
You make a really important point there, Chris, right? Which is it's about output. And you mentioned that in the first thing you said, but I think it was easy to miss, which is copyright is never about what you read, what you process. It is about output. It's about watching content, reading content you didn't pay for, selling content, making content available that you didn't pay for, that you don't have control of. So the idea that all of these LLMs can learn off the corpus of human knowledge, I think is correct. But then the same as any human, what they do with that knowledge, well, that is subject to copyright law. And so it's nearly about having a layer of guardrails over the top, the same way that at the moment the models don't produce hate speech and they don't produce political imagery and that sort of stuff to say, hey, you better be careful. Just because you've read these books doesn't mean that you can let other people read them. Even if you do, Chris, to your point, they don't at the moment and maybe they never will. But even if they do have a perfect memory, it doesn't mean that they can use that memory to share it with everybody else.
Yeah, copyright's always been a production law, not a consumption law. But what is interesting actually is there's copyright plus licensing. So there's a whole other area here which we've sort of been alluding to and conflating around licensing. Like, just because you're allowed to read and store and train off copyrighted material doesn't mean you're allowed to steal the access to that material in the beginning, at the beginning, which is what they did apparently. And so I wonder if there is going to be changes in licensing. So when you purchase the book or you purchase a corpus of many books, there will be a line in there that says, the license does not allow you to use this for training. So that's now not copyright law. That's kind of like usage or licensing law. And that's a whole other ballgame. So there's a lot of nuances here that need to be teased out over time.